or different burning, that type of thing, they are being looked at right now. After every event, we revisit what our emergency plan tells us to do to see if there's any more information so we can improve it. But if we are doing some temporary measures, there will be other measures that will be put in where we can quickly, but some of the other stuff will take a little bit longer.
I believe we, to a point where
lady with
we
the check.
passed these questions on to the question and answer
Sir, I
period.
can't hear you. I'm hard of hearing. If you could use the mic, I'd appreciate it. The gentleman in the gray hair.
Use the mic.
I do have a question, though. I was one of the people who was evacuated.
Is this one that can be left to the end when
No,
there's a general
question for this
roundup?
gentleman. I have a question for this gentleman.
Please be fairly brief, Mrs. Chair.
I will definitely be much more brief than the last gentleman. I was one of the people that was asked to be evacuated. In fact, dear Brian almost got a roommate. However, my question is, I see you've got a lot of good ideas and what you propose should be going forward. We've had floods before, you showed us that. I've always been dismayed with government in that things are studied to death. My fear again is that what you've proposed, we're going to look at it again and go over similar ground from studies that may have been done in the past. And we're going to spend money and time and effort doing this. What kind of reassurances can you give us, along with the others that are here, that we're not going to do what I call this? I call this hot air. And that's all we've had with a lot of government action, is this. We need actual physical, let's get it done. And I'd like to know what reassurances can you give us that we're not going to have this again.
That's what, to answer your question, thanks, it's a good question. The expert panel and the task forces, what that is about is what can we action. You're right, instead of just studying things to death, what are some of the things that need to be built? What are some of the things that need to be improvements in monitoring so we can be better prepared for the next time? But the expert panel, the report that comes out of that will be for action. These are the things that we can action in the short term. These are the things that we should action in the medium term and then the long term. That is what the panel has been convened for. They're not city employees. They're outside parties that we brought in. We want to bring in on the task forces as well so that we can action these. Did that answer your question?
Not really.
Okay.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Speed is virtuous.
Thanks. I will be very quick, and I do know the people on the expert panel are very good people, the administrative background, some engineering background, and certainly some political background. But my question is, do you have anybody on this committee opposed who has cost construction control background? Any forensic auditor or finance people who could help write RFPs so that we make sure we're getting what we can afford, not a Rolls-Royce wish list that never happens, but afford that we can afford.
Yeah. I think what you're speaking to, Mr. Lord, is kind of some value engineering stuff. No, the answer to your question, no, there is nobody on the panel specifically for that. The panel has been convened to make recommendations for action going forward. The action will be design, construction, it can be policy, can be process, can be operating procedures, all of those. As far as physical infrastructure, what will happen is that the outcomes from this panel will be handed to administration, to the others who will then do that design, get that design done, get that construction done. So what you're talking to will be part of that process. There won't be detailed cost estimates as part of this process.
I believe we should move on to the next speaker.
And before we do that,
be able to question on a much wider scope of topics. It's clear that there are many loose ends out there, and I'm quite sure there are quite a number that haven't put their hands up yet, but loose ends putting their hand up. Anyway, I think it's time to move on. I would like to
Mr.
now-
Demeter, I certainly agree with you, and thank you very much for that. We did want to, at the beginning of this event, and thank you so much for the previous presenter, we did want to acknowledge the volunteers that helped put this program together, and our vice president wanted to do that. He's actually a candidate himself, and he's dropped by to do it. So we're going to give an acknowledgement break for 1 minute while you're getting your questions ready, and we're getting ready to hear our next speaker. So James Maxson, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. As Brian indicated, I am the Vice President of the Calgary Leadership Forum. I'm also a candidate in Ward 11. The elbow, the dam, and the reservoir is in Ward 11. And also the 9 feet of water. So I'm very interested in what's going on here today. I look forward to the report that will come out. But I have to leave because I have people waiting for me because I'm door knocking in Ward 11 and I want to win on October the 21st and give effective representation in Ward 11. But in my capacity as introductory, or as Vice President of the Calgary Leadership Forum, I'd like to acknowledge the Deputy Mayor, Richard Boothman from Ward 6, who is here today. I'd also like to acknowledge the other possible candidates that are running for civic election, the guests that are here, and all the various speakers for spending your time with us today. But to put on an event like this, you need a lot of people from the Calgary Leadership Forum, and I'd like to just run through their responsibilities and their names. As program chair, it's Brian Lee, who is also the vice president. Member contact is Dolores Pilser. The faculty and the agenda was by Dennis Little, Charles Hanson, Terry Wong, and Kendrick Charles. The facility in this particular location has been organized by Joe Sasa. The media is Elaine Host. Social media is Steve Chapman. Registration is again Dolores, who's doing a wonderful job. Lauren Gardstart. The interest group is Bob Martin's Pool. And the proceeding and the report, which I'm looking forward to, is Bruce Lee, Dennis Little, and Tyler Pinder. And the committee members are Tom Dixon, Narges Dosa, myself is James Maxson, and the volunteer by Heather Saskatchewski. I hope I got that right. And the videographic photographer is Henry Jonick. A lot of these events are put on by some very dedicated people, and I'd like to acknowledge each and every one of them for your many hours and involvement with the Calgary Leadership Forum and your fine work as seen by all of you here today and what will be the proceedings at the end of this particular event. And an acknowledgement to all of our guest speakers. You have a big task ahead of you. You have a great deal of responsibility in the days ahead, and I'm looking forward to receiving your reports and working with you as the new councillor in Ward 11. Thank you very much.
I hope that the way is now clear to call on our next speaker, Professor Jerry Osborne, who's been a geology prof at the University of Calgary for the past 40 years. His specialities have been mainly the top part, i.e. the bit we see, of superficial geology, quaternary as we call it in the trade, environmental geology, superficial processes, and so on, i.e. what we walk on and what we see and what gets washed away by floods. Jerry Osborne.
I think I can do this without a microphone. Let me know if that fails. I'm used to bellowing in large lecture halls. And I think I'll just run the projector myself. We'll see how that goes. Okay, so I think this is this title more or less summarizes what I'm going to talk about in the next 10 or 15 minutes. Some overlap with David's talk. This is more general and ideally would have preceded that. Can you do this? Okay. So I'm going to talk about how a particular flood hazard is established in some watershed, in this case the city of Calgary. I'm not going to talk about the social implications of the hazard, just how the hazard is established. So the first point I want to make is the definition of a floodplain. A floodplain is a plain that floods. And I particularly like this quote. Floodplains are not regions that just happen to be adjacent to rivers. They don't simply experience periodic flooding, they are formed by periodic flooding. So normal low flows, the river is confined to its channel, but in the high flows it overtops the banks, spreads out over the adjacent ground, and deposits sediment adjacent to the river. That becomes the floodplain. Flooding of the floodplain is the most natural process you can imagine, and we should not act surprised when the floodplain floods. So this is a qualitative look at the relationship between the amount of river flow and how often that river flow might happen, what we call a frequency. So on the left axis we have river flow, what hydrologists call discharge, normally measured in cubic meters per second. That's just the volume of the river going by. And we have large discharges high up on the axis, small ones farther down. So continuous gradation of discharges that we might see in some particular river. And then on the horizontal axis, frequency of a particular flow. How often does it happen? So this happens to be an inverse relationship. That's just the nature of climate on planet Earth. The situation is that very high discharges happen rarely, and low discharges are very common. It's just the way the atmosphere works on this planet. And then intermediate river flows will have intermediate frequencies. So it's the job of the hydrologist to quantify this graph. And thus we can predict how often we're going to get a particular high discharge, for example, one that overtops the banks. And the way this is done is to use the historical record of the river in question. So David actually had a fancier graph than this, more complete. This graph ends in 1996, but what I want to show here is the graph shows the high discharge, the peak high discharge in every year since 1911, when annual discharge measurements were started in Calgary. And it also shows some previous big floods whose discharges are estimated from high water marks that were recorded by people living then. So it ends in 96 here, but we know we had a 2005 flood that got up to about there. We had our current flood this summer, which got up to about there. But the point I want to show here is that we have a different high water discharge each year. So it's very variable. That's the randomness of the atmosphere on this planet. So it's the job of the hydrologist to take this record, assume that the future behavior of the river is going to be similar to the past behavior, and come up with a statistical prediction of how often a particular discharge or flow will occur. And the hydrologist comes up with what's called a recurrence interval. So, which is the average time that we might expect between floods of a particular magnitude or discharges of a particular number. So here we have river flow again on the vertical axis, and we have recurrence intervals on the horizontal axis, the average time between floods of a particular magnitude. So here the graph intersects the axis at 1. A recurrence interval of 1 means it's going to happen every year. So that's going to be the minimum that the river